Hello again! In this video, I will be redrawing this guy into a digital illustration. This sketch was from a previous sketchbook tour. I'll link that video in the cards if you wanna check that out. I used watercolor and colored pencils to paint this, but digitally, I will use Affinity Designer for a more polished work. But first, I'm working in Krita for some freehand sketching. Sketching in Krita before Affinity Designer is out of personal preference. My Krita settings and brushes are already optimized for my freehand workflow. The original painting is a workable reference for color and pose, but it still needs fixing. He could be a video game hero, so I enlarged the head a bit to make him look younger. I saved it as a JPG, then transitioned over to Affinity Designer. With the pen tool, I traced over the sketch. It's a straightforward pen tool job using a simple black outline. Starting like this means I can worry about the layer order later as I get what is essentially grunt work out of the way. The plan is to have a smooth silhouette with a textured shading. To fill an outline with color, I selected the shape, then head over to the color panel. Between these two circles, the top is the outline color while the lower is the fill color. Clicking on the double arrow switches the two colors. While the shape is still selected, I can shift the color around on the wheel. This is another repetitive task, so I switched to random colors before I decided on the actual palette. For patterns like the chevron on the scarf, I used a clipping mask to clean them up. In the layers panel, I nested the arrows underneath the main scarf shape. Here's the base layers all filled up. Seeing the whole figure vectorized like this, I realized I could still improve the silhouette further. I broke away from the sketch by nudging the nodes around, repositioning elements here and there. I added the curved edges to the cowl. These details reflect his bird theme since they look like simple feathers. These were achieved by using the node tool. On my selected shape, clicking on the edges creates a new node. With the same tool, hovering over a line gives the cursor this reverse S, meaning I can drag the line into a curve. It actually created Bezier handles on the connected nodes that both adapt to how I drag the curve. At this point, I started choosing the colors. I was already happy with the initial palette, so the primary hues live on in this version. Red, blue, and yellow accented by his dark skin. I made a quick adjustment layer by adding a rectangle on top of everything. Then I set that layer to the hue blending mode and changed the color to white. That was a roundabout way of making an adjustment layer actually. So instead of my caveman method, you can definitely make a new adjustment layer by clicking on this button in the Layers panel and pick from this list. I chose HSL, which is Hue Saturation. It created an adjustment layer that can be rearranged as its own layer. Nevertheless, my method still does the job of rendering the whole canvas into a monochromatic tone. This let me ascertain that the darkest areas are his skin, his hood, and cowl, while the lightest areas are his pants, sword, and fire. I added the rest of the scarf details, more chevron patterns, and a red outline. I used thick line strokes this time because that's less nodes to move around. It's also convenient if I want to thicken or narrow the arrows down by changing the value of the line width in the stroke panel. I redid the tail of the scarf this way as well. For the stripes on his pants, I drew the lines using the vector brush tool. The brush setting is from the hand lettering set, which was available for free at the Affinity store for a limited time. Affinity Designer handles vector brushes by basically stretching a raster texture as you draw. Since these are vector strokes, they can be corrected by dragging the nodes to place. His clothing is partially inspired by Filipino warrior outfits, especially from the Visayas Islands. They wore square and triangle patterns on tattoos, pants, and vests, while wielding one-handed short swords. Meanwhile, the mask and bird theme are carryovers from my Plague Doctor obsession. To add feather details on his cowl, I made a wedge shape which I duplicated, then reshaped to cover a row. Then duplicated that group of feathers for the next row. Instead of covering the inner cowl with short feathers, I elongated the wedges so it would be less busy in this area. It matches how bird wings have both short and long feathers anyway. The last detail to add was the fringe of his cowl. First, I formed what will be the negative space, reshaping it to fit how the cowl is skewed. Then with this shape and the trim shape selected, I hold Alt and hit the Subtract Geometry button. And voila! The negative space is cut out from the fringe. By holding Alt, the Subtract button creates a compound layer where both the negative and the positive layers are preserved. So if I reposition each fringe, they're conforming to the trim of the positive layer. Finally, onto the pixel persona for the shading phase. I shaded using the spray paint brush, which is a default brush. Lassoing areas for shading gives quick sharp cuts to the airbrush technique. I would also return to the designer persona to apply noisy gradients that shade across large areas like his hood and beak. The textures help prevent that overly glossy feel. It's a pleasing contrast against the smooth vector. To give any colors some noise like this, I head over to the color panel. By clicking on this circle labeled opacity, it toggles into the noise setting. Then you can adjust the slider to your liking. The main light source is obviously the blue fire. However, since I kept the white background, the blue highlight stayed its strongest on the head and arm areas. To balance out the coldness of the blue light, the shadows had to be warm. So I picked the shading from the red to purple spectrum of the color wheel. I faded the top edges of the feathers with the transparency tool. That way, their colors merge with the airbrush shading on the cowl. I brought that paper effect to his pants. Crisscrossing the wrinkles rendered what I would describe as crumpled paper. This was when the style was clicking on its own. The wrinkled paper and the cutout effects, he was starting to look like a toy. His skin contributes to that by reminding me of a vinyl figure, the type that has a matte surface that diffuses light. It would be so cool to have this 3D printed into a sculpture, but his current pose will be tested by gravity. He would need rebalancing if he were to literally stand on his own as a physical object. I don't have a name for him, so I've been calling him by the totally inspired title, BIRD SHAMAN. Feel free to suggest a better name. I don't like naming characters as much as I don't like drawing faces. Keeping identities vague is more appealing to me. The body needed some highlights for a coat of polish. Lighting up the beak and scarf with subtle swishes of pastels served to push those areas forward. While the lighting on his feet is influenced by the white background. But instead of an obvious gray from black, there's a tinge of purple to give it more life. And lastly, I shaded the fire. I didn't want to over-render it, but it was also in danger of being under-rendered. A good reference would be the 2D special effects in League of Legends animations. Some well-organized layers. My experience drawing animation assets trained me to keep my layers organized. For my personal work, I usually assume I'm gonna animate this later, so I layered the parts accordingly. I can easily imagine rigging this for an idle animation loop. I completed this illustration with a minimal background. A round shadow below him would establish that he's hovering above the floor. Then I laid out some square ripples that matched the geometric style and also framed the character. And cue the before and after montage. Please give a like if you found this video helpful in using Affinity Designer for illustration. Also consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more art videos. Thank you for watching and bye!